but I have a little story to tell you today. I will be telling the prep story in greater detail in the next book, so stay tuned. I'm still working on it. I'm polishing it up. There's a lot more, to come, so I think that should be out. I should be finished with it by Christmas, which if I'm not, my wife's going to pack my bags and send me, because that's why I spend a lot of my Saturdays and Sundays working on prep history, But it is a labor of love, and my years here have been really incredible. Confucius said, find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And that's really the way I feel about prep. It's just been an extraordinary experience, and I really enjoy it. But I really need to move on and show you just as I put this together, see how high-tech I am? School should be proud of me. When I started, there was a blackboard and a piece of chalk, and that was it. So here's the story, my story. I'm going to tell my story rather than the school story per se, and some prep will weave into this. What's this Brooklyn boy doing here at Fairfield Prep? So I'm going to give you a bit of my journey, And how did this all start? Well, here's my college, SUNY New Paltz, off the New York State Thruway. I was there from 1966 to 1970, the craziest time in American history, quite possibly. I was the first person in my family to go to college. Neither of my parents graduated high school. Think about that. My grandparents all came from the other side, from Poland and Lithuania. My grandparents were incredibly intelligent people, but not educated. My parents also, my father dropped out of school. He would have been a senior. He was a senior when Pearl Harbor happened. He would have been graduating that next June, but instead he joined the Navy and was out in the Pacific for 4 years, in war. So he never went back after the war was over. So here I am. This is, nice campus, pretty nice school. The old campus, the new campus. I spent a lot of time outside that building protesting the war in Vietnam. Well, I'll explain that. But one of my interests was American Indian Studies. It still is, many of you guys know about that. And I taught courses here on American Indians. And one of the great resources I found in my studying of the Northeast Indians of North America were these books called The Jesuit Relations in North America. These are original documents written by the black robes, as the Indians called them, who were there on site working with the Indians. And I found, as I began to read them for my research, an incredible objectivity, considering they're writing these in the 1600s. I was very drawn into their understanding, their sensitivity to the Indians. Now, of course, it didn't always work out too well. The Iroquois, in particular, found the Jesuits to be a problem, and that's what led to their martyrdom. But, of course, St. Isaac Jogues is one of the prominent members of the society who was just a remarkable guy, intrepid, in his love for the church, his belief that he was helping these people. And I was very impressed by the writings. There's another picture. He, of course, is 1600s, as I say. This is where New France is just being built up, and the French missionaries. So that was, to me, a very big thing. There's a French version of the so-called Jesuit Relations, 71 volumes. And again, great, this is original. I always tell my guys, in history, original documents are the most important things, rather than secondary or tertiary sources. And these are original documents. And this, you can find these, wonderful stuff. So I was drawn into this. I knew a little bit about the Jesuits, but this really started to awaken my interest. And these guys are pretty together at such an early time. And I was an anthropology major in college, so I thought they were doing some anthropological work, The other thing, of course, I was also interested in is Asia. As many of you know, I teach courses in Asian studies, and I came across Matteo Ricci, an Italian Jesuit, who was the first one to crack the seal and be invited into Beijing in 1601 to work with the emperor. And he had been petitioning for a long time. The Jesuits were down in Macau in southern China, and he kept petitioning the emperor to let me in to teach, And the emperor said, yeah, I'll let you in as long as you help me learn some other stuff like math, science. And the Jesuits, as they always have, had the complete package. Not just theology, not just Latin, but math, science, and they were the Renaissance people, let's face it. So very interesting stuff. Here's Ricci with the Confucian scholar. Of course, the Jesuits got in trouble there too when they became a little too friendly with the Confucians, and they got brought up on charges of being not faithful to the mission. But I think they were very faithful to the mission. Ricci said the only thing missing in Confucianism is Christ. And he thought he could interject that because he thought that the Confucian value system was actually very advanced given the world that we were living in at that time. So that drew me into it. Now, of course, there was another thing. And I know some of you might find this a little sensitive, but you have to understand the psychology. We're all products of our time. And I was in school from 1966 to 1970, the height of the anti-war movement. My campus was swept up in it. And so many schools were, so we were not particularly unique. But as I began my participation in the anti-war movement, out of a commitment to values, and I always believed value not acted upon is not a true value. And I am in favor of protecting people, their lives, their culture, and anything that was going to destroy that I had a problem with, and I thought that this was, an issue. So anyway, here we are marching. I don't think you see me there, but I think this is downtown Poughkeepsie. Of course, this is the biggest town from New Paltz across the river, But as I was doing this, I started to read about Jesuits in the movement, the Berrigan brothers, right? I said, wow, this is amazing. Even making the cover of Time magazine, So here you have these old Jesuits going back to the 1600s and so on, and now you have contemporary Jesuits to my lifetime who are engaged in the anti-war movement in the belief that this war needed to be ended for justice purposes. I was attracted to that, I was very impressed that they were putting themselves out there. And again, apologies to anybody who have a different position on this war. I still think that Vietnam War was a mistake, and that we were right in protesting it. So anyway, next stop, summer of '69. I wasn't at Woodstock. Every year I have to tell my guys, how was Woodstock Day? I said, no, I wasn't in Woodstock. I was in... I had friends who were there, but I was in Europe. I had met a French girl the year before. Annick Surratt, like the painter. And we had, my parents were so nice to put her up in our house in Long Island, and she invited me back to visit her that next summer. And so I went to visit her and her family. All I remember is that her father started drinking wine at like 7 in the morning. But I did develop an affinity for cognac as a result of my stay there. So, but as I'm traveling, in between seeing her and her family, I hitchhiked through Europe. In those days, it was, not a bad thing to do. Today, we're all afraid of our kids hitchhiking. But that's what I did. And I'm in the town of Lyon, famous for its cuisine, beautiful town in France. And I'm hitchhiking, and this guy stops to pick me up in a white Peugeot automobile. And he spoke English, which was good, because I didn't speak French. Un poco español, but not French. And he said to me, hey, look, I'm heading down to Torremolinos in southern Spain, Costa del Sol. I have to meet my wife, my father-in-law there, and I'm really in a rush. If you want to help me drive, I'll put you up when we get down there. So what the hell, I had nothing better to do. Give me some free food and housing, right? So I said, sure. And he knew a tremendous amount of history. We stopped in different towns, like Burgos, for example. He showed me the great cathedral in Burgos and all the great art there and so on. So off we went. Comes to find out that he was a big shot at Harrods department store in London, which I actually had visited earlier just to see what it was like. They have amazing, department store. He was like one of the, I can't find his name. I kept a journal where I wrote things down and so on. And I know somewhere in one of my boxes in my garage that my wife is always yelling at me to throw away. I have my journal, and I have his name. I can't give you his name, but he told me he was somebody big in the department store, and he actually offered me a job. And I said, nah, you know, I want to go back to college. I have my senior year, and I think I want to be a teacher. He said, well, you know, this retail's not a bad way to go. Since this is a business breakfast, I should give a little kudos. But I said, you know, I do appreciate that, but I think I want to go back to college. So he gave me his information to contact him if I wanted to change my mind. And off we went down to Torremolinos. It was the most beautiful beach I'd ever seen in my life. It's one of those places you can just jump into the sea and just float because it's so buoyant because of all the salt, you know. And he put me up in his villa. This is not his villa, but it looks very much like this. Bigger though, you know. And when all was said and done, and I had to leave to go back up to see my girlfriend, he said to me, I'm going to put you on the train, the midnight special from Malaga to Madrid, which I did take. It was very nice. And before I left him, he said, let me give you some advice. He said, if you want a job, you advertise yourself. Don't answer want ads. He said, you know what, I run this business. He said, I never hire people. We have to put want ads in the newspapers by law, but he said, I always hire people like I wanted to recruit, spontaneously, people I meet. And he said, my advice to you, young man, for the rest of your life is if you find a place you want to work, if you find a job you want, advertise yourself. You tell them, here I am. That's exactly what I wound up doing. You know, a few years later, I decided I want to be a teacher. I decided that private school was the place to go, a place where there would be a value system, where I could teach crazy courses like anthropology, sociology, and so on. And I was already attracted to the Jesuits based on my experience as a scholar, and hopefully at least a scholar, a budding scholar. And so I sent a cover letter and my resume to prep. Sure enough, they called me back. I was stunned. I had never been to Fairfield. You know, so my wife and I drove up, and I met people.
Oh, right.
One of the first people I met was Tim McGillicuddy. He was everything. He had been Dean of Men for many years. At that point, he was assistant principal. Just a great guy who gave me solid advice and asked me a lot of good questions. I also considered him the head of what I call the Irish Mafia at Prep, because we had all these Irish guys, you know, McGillicuddy and McLaughlin and right, Lavery, and they sort of were the core people back then, you know. But he was just a great guy. Oh yeah, by the way, he did serve as headmaster. He's the only lay headmaster that we actually had. So I just thought I'd mention that. Another man I met, some of you guys remember Foles, yes. The man, the bird, Bob Sylvester, who was the head basketball coach. They won the great championship, state championship in 1969. This man was just, again, very welcoming. Served in many capacities, including in missions director, was one of the first development people that we had, and was rather, you know, insightful about what was needed at Prep. Just an all-around great guy. Moved on to Scranton later, but he was very instrumental. And since he was a basketball coach, he was interested in me because I said I'd like to coach basketball one day. I had played basketball in high school, and he let me coach freshman basketball, which was cool. So that was important. And of course, Uncle Lou, right? As soon as I heard that accent, I said, oh man, maybe I could get a job here. He sounds like me. Right? He was from the Bronx, I'm from Brooklyn, and he was my mentor. You know, I say big brother, more like a father figure to me at Prep, and many of the guys in history, whether it be Dave Driscoll, Bruce Jaffe, the whole bunch of us, we were raised by Uncle Lou. He taught us how to teach. And one of the things he always told me is be yourself in that classroom. The most important thing the kids are going to remember is you, not the subject. And I took that advice to heart. And of course, this is the guy who was the headmaster at the time, Jerry Starrett. Right? Jerry, I got to tell you these stories. I don't want to. Am I going to run really late, Colleen? I'm sorry.
No.
That's the teacher. It's the teacher in me,
No,
right?
we have another half hour.
Jerry was quite progressive, needless to say. And the school was going through some big changes back then. We had this thing called a convocation, where they were opening up the curriculum, changing the schedule, block scheduling. We had, of course, a thing called mini courses. We had Capsule, which was a school within a school. He didn't create it, but he nurtured it. And I thought I would never get hired by him because the first round of interviews, I thought I had no chance because I said I wanted to be a social science teacher. And they said, well, we don't have social science. And I said, well, maybe you should. I wanted to teach anthropology and sociology. Well, we don't have those, so I said, maybe you should. So they sent me home, and I figured, that's it, I'm done. Then I got a call back from the office out of the blue, figuring I'm not going to be a prep. I actually had an offer from Sacred Heart High School down in Yonkers, offered me a position. I was ready to take that, and then prep called back and said, Father Starrett wants to see you. So I said, okay. So I went back in to see Jerry Starrett, and he said to me, John, we don't have a teaching position, but we do have this job in administration called Dean of Men. And I laughed, you know, because I didn't see myself in that role, and you guys know me, it's not my role. He said to me, so have you had any experience in administration? And I said to him, I know this is probably going to blow the interview, but a couple of years ago, I was part of the group that occupied the administration building on campus in protest of the war. And he laughed. He said, the kids will love you. You know? And I was stunned that he actually found that funny, because I thought I was the end, no chance. And sure enough, I was hired. But here's a crazy story. Father Frank Deavy. This was a wonderful person. I have him down there as a Latin teacher. At the time that I was being hired, he was the Dean of Men. It was his position. So picture this, guys, you know. My wife and I drive up to prep. We're sitting in the back parking lot, you know, on the sound side of the school. We're 22 years old. Once upon a time, I was 22 years old. Remember those days, right? And I'm having this interview, and she's sitting there reading a magazine waiting for me, because we were going to explore Fairfield in case I got the job, where would we live, and so on. And Father Deavy, the Dean of Men, is walking around the parking lot. And he walks up to her and pokes his head in the window and says, what are you doing here, young lady? I think he thought she was a Laurelton girl. And she says, well, I'm waiting for my husband. Oh, your husband? Well, what's he here for? Said, well, he's interviewing for a job. And he said, oh yeah, what job is that? And she said, well, I think it's called Dean of Men. He said, that's my job. That's how Father Deavy found out that he was being moved. And of course, with the Jesuits, they never really get fired, they just get recycled. So they moved him back into the classroom. But that's actually how he found out. True story. And then here I am. In 1972, doing my job, and again, notice those sideburns. You know, I was really pretty hip there. I also wore cowboy boots because I had just come back from a graduate school program at Oklahoma University, and I call this my 3 years of ethnographic research. And in fact, I actually wrote my master's thesis in sociology on graffiti at Fairfield Prep on the desks. Remember the old wooden desks the guys would write on there? They were like archaeology sites. You could go down. And you couldn't just wash it off with some soap, you know. So that was, I did that for 3 years. So the question is, okay, I'm at prep. I'm happy, I'm enjoying, but will I stay? There was a good chance that I would move on, at least in my mind's eye, my wife's, opinion that maybe I should just move on to a public school, or do what I really always wanted to do, which was teach college and go back and finish my doctorate, that kind of thing. But why did I stay all these years? These are the people why I stayed. These Jesuits that I met, and not just Jesuits, but these men who were working at prep, Father Bob Sproul, French teacher, many of you remember him, of course. He walked up to me at the first faculty social and said, "So, you're the new Dean of Discipline, huh?" Father Starrett had never used that title with me, Dean of Discipline. He had created what I thought was a role more like an academic dean almost. Well, you know, you work with the kids, you talk to them about their problems, and I thought I was more like a guidance counselor than a disciplinarian. So Sproul walks up to me and he says, "Just remember one thing, suit jacket, necktie, that's what makes a man." And I said, "Oh God, here we go." And so I thought I was on the outs with him, but we became very close friends. And what I thought was great about him, when he would see me at school at 4:30 in the afternoon, as so many teachers do, if you walk around prep today, Father, you know that's true, we're still working, we're grading quizzes, we're working with kids' clubs. He would walk in and he would stick his head in my classroom door and say, "What are you doing here? Get home to your family. You have obligations to your family. Never forget that. Prep is great, but your family is very important too." And he always had this idea that he understood that we had different roles and different responsibilities. Right? This man, to me, was the most impressive in many ways. Father Welch, right? They called him Lefty. I never quite figured out why. He taught Latin. Well, he taught everything. All the Jesuits back then taught everything. Latin, English, math. He had his classroom. He was always covered with chalk.
Yes.
Right, wasn't he?
And he had some funny phrase. I'm trying to remember.
Well, he used to always refer to the students as my kiddos.
Yeah.
The kiddos. Well, I used to, as Dean of Men, I had plenty of flexibility to move around the building, and I used to make believe I was working on the lockers outside his door just to hear him talk and to see his interaction with the boys. And it was one of love and devotion to them. He had a crusty exterior, but he was like a big bear. He was a wonderful man. And anytime we had a faculty meeting, he always was most concerned about the welfare of the students and what we were doing for them. I just found him to be a great guy. And of course, he had Latin scholars. They were winning awards all over the state all the time. He was just a brilliant guy.
Here we are.
And of course, what can you say, right?
Yes.
Two of the most important, I call them the pillars of prep, Earl Duke Lavery, of course, football coach, a math teacher, and Father Brissett. I got to know these people. They were very supportive. They would give me a hard time. "What are you going to do about that noise in the hall?" Well, I don't know. I'm working on it. Right? You know how it is, right? And actually, I had a pretty close encounter with being let go, I thought, when Father Brissett was on a faculty evaluation committee, and he came into my classroom to see my sociology class, and he fell asleep. And I said, "That's it. I'm done." Then I come to find out that he had a condition. He was actually getting ill, and he had a hard time staying awake. And so I felt a little better when I knew it wasn't me that was putting him to sleep. Father Shaughnessy, right? Another one of the great Jesuits. Always had a smile on his face. Never had a bad day teaching. I was impressed that here's a man who taught freshman theology, among other things, and he was very instrumental in the world religions course, which was just really developing back then. And he solicited me. He said, "I know you're an American Indian guy. I'd like to add units on American Indian religion in my freshman class." And we began collaborating, and I began suggesting books and so on for him. And I thought I was humbled that this man with all this experience and all this greatness was coming to me, this hippie kid from the 60s, who had some knowledge of Indians, and he was soliciting my advice for how to approach the study of Indian religions. So I just think he was very much the heart and soul of prep, and I loved him very much. Another man, notice all the Jesuits who were there, right, as compared to today, those of us, it's funny because Donna Andrade always said to me, "Well, you guys just rubbed elbows with the Jesuits. You understand the Jesuit mission from personal experience with these guys." And certainly that's true. Father Pell, was interviewing him the other day about prep history. This man did everything. He was, of course, a math teacher, always got the level 3 kids who were having a hard time, and of course he could work wonders with them in geometry. But aside from that, he was the only guidance counselor in the school for a while, and he was the registrar and schedule. You could go into his room and he would have this big board where he was putting the courses on the matrix. He did all these things today that we would have 3 or 4 people doing. And he's still around. Jim Bowler, some of you were there when Jim was there. Jim is, I consider, also a very close friend, very tolerant of my madness and my point of view on the world. I consider him a very progressive guy. He pushed us with the global studies, with the Asian studies. He pushed me to teach courses in American Indian studies, and was always joking with me, you should teach a course on American history through Indian eyes. You know, I said, okay. So we developed this American Indian course, and he was always very encouraging, and you can always go to him. We would have some arguments, but it was always a mutual respect. You could say anything to the man. Very priestly. Charlie Allen, see another one, right? Charlie Allen, who I just visited in a hospital recently, you know, he had a bit of an incident. I think he's now in a rehab center or something.
In Carrollton for probably another week.
Carrollton.
Yeah.
Yeah, I visited him in St. Vincent's. He had a fall, and they were working on him. Another one of the headmasters that I had, you know, tremendous. By the way, I call them headmasters. The title has evolved, Mr. President. It used to be principal. Then it was. Now we're up to the president. I don't know what comes next. Grand Poobah. But the thing about Charlie is that he loved to entertain people. He loved to go out. His favorite place in the world was Legal Seafood.
Yeah.
And he would take bunches of us out. And I remember online, you know, with him waiting to get in, it was pretty crowded. I said, oh yeah, I really want to get some clam strips. He looked at me and said, clam strips? He said, no, he said, John, you need the whole belly clam. And I said, what? He said, yeah, believe me, I'm right about this. So he turned me on to the full belly clams, and I've been eating them ever since. He insisted that I try that rather than the clam strips, and so I owe that to him, if nothing else. You know, great guy, great speaker, of course, right? A tremendous speaker at commencements and various functions. And Raspberry Beret. You guys, many of you are older and don't know Father Jim Arrowman. He came to us from Chicago, didn't quite understand prep culture all that well, but adapted. Had a rough start. He had a heart attack in the very first month of his stay here. But boy, he loved the school and he loved sports. He loved hockey and football, and he always wore this red raspberry color beret, and whenever we came onto the field for the games, the kids in the stands would start singing that Prince song, Raspberry, remember that song? And he would walk up and down the sidelines or in the stands for the hockey game. And his devotion to the school was incredible. He, let's put it this way, here it is in the middle of July, and I'm coming back to check my mail, and I had a couple of questions for him, and they said, oh, he's up on the 4th floor in Xavier. So I went up to see him, and there he is. He's in a t-shirt, sweating profusely, and he's screwing desks together in the middle of the summer, doing things that we would ordinarily associate with janitors, but he just had to be hands-on, and he always was. And I have to give him credit, because he's the guy who had the opportunity or to say yes or no on my original prep history. He was the headmaster when I started writing, you know, researching and writing, and he gave me the go-ahead and the support, and so I thank him for that. But ultimately, with all these people, you know, the Jesuits, the lay faculty, the most important reason why I've stayed is my students, you know. You people, my guys, my boys. You know, I only have one child, a daughter. I'm very proud of her. But I overheard her once at one of these events. We were at a football game or something, and somebody said, so your dad teaches all men, you know, how come, you know, you only have one child? I said, well, I don't know, that's the way it worked out. And they said to her, wouldn't he be happy if he had a son? Your dad works with men all the time. And she said, he doesn't need a son. He has all his boys. And I think she understands that very well. And a couple of years ago, when my wife was pressuring me to retire, because I was teaching at the university level at WestCon, my wife said, why don't you just leave prep and just stay at Western? And my daughter interceded, and she said, no, Mom, he has to stay with his boys at prep. And I think she was right. So I did retire from the night school. So that's the most important reason. And of course, I began researching the school's history in the late 1980s. And as I started researching the school's history, back to the Jesuits again, Father Leo Riley, the first principal of the school. Why did I come to know him? Because he kept a headmaster's journal, a daily reporting on what was going on in the school. And I felt I came to know this man very well. And I don't think prep would be prep without him. Amazing guy. Now, just very briefly, I can't do this to any great extent, but one of the things I noticed as I began researching the school is that we have a history of pranksterism. In almost every case, very benign and not particularly, offensive in any way. So there's one, there's Bellarmine Hall, of course, where the Jesuits at first were living and so on. There's this one story, I call it the kidnapped prepster. I'm just going to read you what I found, what I said on page 34 of my original publication here. On or about that time of the year, so the grapevine tells it, a little scheme was hatched one Friday evening at a local ice cream parlor. I hope it was an ice cream parlor in Fairfield. A certain student whose last name begins with the letter G was kidnapped by his fellow classmen, tied up and left at the doorstep of the Jesuit residence, Bellarmine Hall. Then the doorbell was rung and the culprits attempted their getaway. Father Dolan must have been standing very near the door because he answered the ring almost immediately and discovered the writhing student at his feet. After them, he called to a group of Jesuit scholastics who had assembled upon hearing the commotion. The perpetrators by this time had expected to be long gone. However, due to divine intervention or just bad luck, their convertible failed to start. As they attempted to start the car by rolling it down Bellarmine Hall, the hill, they were followed by the scholastics. The whole event seemed like a scene unfolding from a Marx Brothers comedy, and it became an archetype for what we call a tradition of pranksterism. So I always found that to be. I've always been trying to figure out who this student is with the last name of G, Another example, those of you who remember Luce Rocco, remember his car. This is not literally his car, but that's the model that he had. It was an orange Carmen Ghia, right? That he drove around like Franklin Roosevelt. He had the cigarette holder, remember that? Running around town. And he always parked it in the back of McAuliffe Hall. We had a circle back there. Well, one afternoon while he was teaching, a bunch of seniors, they must have been football players or whatever, they literally picked up his car. They carried his car from the front parking lot, okay, to the back of the building. And see, you have the awning here. They put the car right in front of those two doors at the bottom, right, of McAuliffe. And so when the bell rang and people tried to leave the building, there was the car. And of course, Uncle Lou looked out the window for his car and it was gone. Didn't know it was there. So that was a pretty interesting prank in itself. And of course, there's Uncle Lou in the last photo we have of him at prep. He passed away on the 24th of 2011, May 24th. And so what do we say from here? What happens, for the future of prep? I happen to believe very firmly that this school will be here not only decades from now, but hundreds of years from now. And I'd like to think that I've contributed something to the school and to its history, that someday people will be looking back on this period and say, well, these guys had an idea what they wanted to do, that we were carrying on the Jesuit tradition. And I can only tell you that without people like you participating and continuing to participate in prep and its culture, we can't go anywhere. School is only as good as the whole community, and the community is not just the teachers, not just the administrators or the students, it's everybody who is associated, and the alums are a very big part of that. So I thank you so much for being here today and for supporting prep and putting up with my antics, those of you who had me as a teacher. I'm much better now, you know, than I used to be. You know, I've improved. That's one of the great things about teaching. You know, you can actually get better at it over time. So that's where I'm at. Thank you so much for being here.